Hi, this is Carlota, and welcome to the second episode of the Climate Talks. I'm here today with Ian Madison. Ian is a professor at the London School of Economics who specialises on forced migration and refugees, and also in the management of humanitarian emergencies. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, in my last interview, I spoke with Alexander Betts about how climate change is currently one of the biggest drivers of migration and humanitarian emergencies. Well, as you know very well, in the last decades, over 90% of natural disasters have been climate related, and right now, people are 3 times more likely to have been displaced by climate change than by conflict. Yet our humanitarian practices are still very much focused on short-term emergencies, and there's not a proper developmental approach to preventing the impacts of climate change. So, in your experience as an academic and a practitioner in the field, what role do you think the humanitarian sector can play in getting climate change integrated fully into the development agenda?
I think it's a good question, Carlota, and I think I think you've put it well in terms of as humanitarians, what we look at as what we define as a humanitarian emergency tends to be quite constrained into a particular idea of what this emergency is, and I think the way we tend to think about this often ignores much of the larger term processes involved with climate change. So as humanitarians, we tend to focus on natural disasters, famines, and droughts, all of which are implicated with climate change, changing climate, rising temperatures, changing weather patterns. But I think as humanitarians, we tend to be more focused on the much narrower idea of what an emergency is, rather than the broader idea of a changing climate. So in a sense, one challenge will be to redefine our understanding of an emergency to take a broader perspective on that, to understand climate change as a much more drawn out emergency, in other words.
Thank you so much. So within this framework, I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you consider that climate migrations are being politicized? And if so, I mean, how is this influencing the UNHCR, for example, in the possibility of expanding its mandate to incorporate climate refugees? And I mean, how is this issue of political power curtailing the humanitarian practice of mitigating climate change as a whole?
I think there is a political element to this, in terms of certain countries having a political interest in defining climate change a certain way, and other countries defining it another way. And I think a key consideration of this, thinking back to the global refugee regime, which is premised on an idea that to be classified a refugee, one must be have a well-founded fear of persecution. And there is a debate now as to whether we can expand this quite tightly defined idea of a refugee to incorporate climate change refugees, so people fleeing their homes based on climate change. So I think a challenge with this is that, you could make the argument that, given the disproportionate amount of carbon emissions being emitted by industrialized countries, that the blame rests on these countries, and as such, they have a moral obligation to do something about people being displaced by climate change. And I think you can see how politically there would be an interest for a lot of countries to avoid having a conversation like that. So it is a contested space, that's for sure.
Thanks so much for that assessment. That was really interesting. And I now want to shift the conversation to another trend that has been um, reigning over like the humanitarian space in the last few decades, which is the issue of securitization. I think that we saw in one of our classes a really interesting topic with the case of Syrian refugees in Turkey, where, for example, at the beginning, Turkey had an open door policy towards Syrian refugees, and they used humanitarian discourse in welcoming these refugees kind of as, brothers in arms. But at the same time, this was developed by securitized politics that were restricting refugees' movement. Like, for example, they can only reside in certain areas. They were banned from working. And this also developed simultaneously with violent attacks against refugees and an integration of the issue of terrorism into the humanitarian discourse. So I want to ask you, like, as an academic, how does an issue such as the issue of refugees become securitized, and why does it become securitized?
I think it's a really important question, and in particular, given our current context with COVID-19, I think this is a really germane topic that I think will certainly provide us with a lot of things to think about when it comes to securitization. So maybe the first step is just to say a little bit about securitization as a theory, and then to move on to how refugees or displacement as an issue is being securitized or not, and then maybe some kind of contemporary examples. So I think the first thing about securitization theory is that this is a theory that's arising in the mid-1990s in the post-Cold War era. And the key element, I think, one of the key contributions that it makes is that it defines security as a process rather than an objective state. So the Cold War era of classical security studies tended to look at security in terms of military resources, military capacities, standing armies, etc., etc. And I think in the post-Cold War era, scholars in particular at the University of Copenhagen started thinking about actually security is often not an objectively held idea. Rather, what is defined as security is often a fluid concept. So what they do is break down this process into a couple of different components. You have a security actor, who's often a state politician or leader. You'll have something called an existential threat, which is a threat that could shake the very core, poses something so threatening to a certain referent object, by which they mean whatever it is that the security actor is trying to protect. And that this demands extraordinary measures to protect this referent object. So an example would be a political leader saying that something like terrorism poses an existential threat to, let's say, the United States, and this requires extraordinary measures to deal with, such as something like the Patriot Act, which infringes on people's rights and liberties. So this is the basic kind of framework of how this process of securitization works. So when we look at refugees, I think especially within the context of the European Union, there we can see a host of examples of how refugees have tended to be securitized as an existential threat to either the security of a particular state, or more broadly, and I think in some ways more effectively, the social identity of a particular state. So the cultural kind of coherence of the state. And a number of politicians, particularly, but not exclusively, I think, on the far right, have used this kind of process of what we could think of as securitization to paint refugees as a particular threat that in turn requires extraordinary measures such as building a wall or extraordinary rendition or deportations or other such measures. So I think your case of Turkey is a really interesting point in that Turkey, as you said, began with quite an open door policy and defined Syrian refugees as guests, which is semantically quite interesting because Turkey doesn't recognize refugees from anywhere outside of Europe, which is initially where the 1951 Refugee Convention was framed geographically. So Syrians don't have refugee status in Turkey, treated as guests, and certainly on the surface, there's been quite a welcoming kind of discourse towards Syrian refugees. But as you pointed out, the practice of how Syrian refugees are kind of dealt with in Turkey has led to a subtle process of securitization over the years where effectively Syrians are still treated as security threats, as a threat to the country's cohesion or economic labor market, for example, and that this could require other forms of extraordinary measures. I think, unfortunately, you don't have to look too far to see other cases. I think Viktor Orban in Hungary is a good example. But I think there's also examples of cases in Europe where securitization hasn't been followed with refugees. And these are also interesting counterexamples.
Definitely. And thanks for bringing up the issue of Corona at the beginning, because I actually wanted to link into this and ask you about specifically how you think that the Corona crisis is contributing to a further securitization of refugees. Because as we've all seen, there have been a lot of messages from far-right parties across Europe going to the extent of blaming refugees for bringing the virus and for calling for a closure of borders. So do you consider that this crisis, which is a public health crisis, will also turn into a securitized crisis of human rights across the world, and how can this be prevented?
It's a really good question, and it's certainly a disturbing trend in a lot of ways that's been happening with this, the so-called hotspot policy, which is, I think, basically an EU policy to focus resources on areas where refugees are first points of contact within the EU. And I think the result has been certainly criticized as a very serious problem in terms of human rights, that it strips refugees and asylum seekers of a number of fundamental human rights, leaving them in a kind of a legal limbo where they don't have access to a refugee status determination process. They don't have access to a lot of important services, like public education, I think, is quite limited. And they're surrounded by a lot of uncertainty. They're also administered in a way that, though I'm not sure that, I think securitization also is an element here. I think they're also administered as a problematic population that needs to be dealt with in some way or the other. And I think the implications of this on human rights, on refugee well-being, on the kind of legal obligations underscored in the 1951 Refugee Convention, and the kind of intentions of the global refugee regime are certainly problematic. So, I think there's a much broader critique you could make of these camps as a kind of form of imprisonment in some ways of refugees as they enter the EU. I think that's an interesting critique. Whether I go that far or not, I'm not sure, but it certainly is problematic in a number of elements.
It was really interesting how you compared the discourse around Corona to the issue of war, and it made me think a lot about the rollback on human rights following the US Global War on Terror and the US Patriot Act. And I want to ask you like one last question on securitization, which links to all of these issue areas, which is the creation of global refugee hotspots. There's a really interesting article by Polly Pallister-Walkins who describes how refugee hotspots are being deployed to secure both life and liberal political order. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the power dimensions that operate in the securitization of these refugee hotspots and the contention of refugees in certain areas from which they're suspended in a legal limbo from which they can't evolve into resettlement policies?
It's certainly a disturbing trend in a lot of ways that's been happening with this the so-called hotspot policy, which is I think basically an EU policy to focus resources on areas where refugees are first points of contact within the EU. And I think the result has been certainly criticized as a very serious problem in terms of human rights, that it strips refugees and asylum seekers of a number of fundamental human rights, leaving them in a kind of a legal limbo where they don't have access to a refugee status determination process. They don't have access to a lot of important services, like public education, I think, is quite limited. And they're surrounded by a lot of uncertainty. They're also administered in a way that, though I'm not sure that, I think securitization also is an element here. I think they're also administered as a problematic population that needs to be dealt with in some way or the other. And I think the implications of this on human rights, on refugee well-being, on the kind of legal obligations underscored in the 1951 Refugee Convention, and the kind of intentions of the global refugee regime are certainly problematic. So, I think there's a much broader critique you could make of these camps as a kind of form of imprisonment in some ways of refugees as they enter the EU. I think that's an interesting critique. Whether I go that far or not, I'm not sure, but it certainly is problematic in a number of elements.
And now moving outside of Europe, because 60% of the world's refugees are hosted by only 10 states in the global south, which are themselves fragile states, which find it increasingly difficult to sustain populations. And in fact, only 3 states in the world account for 85% of global refugee resettlement efforts. So I want to ask you in my final question about the issue of burden sharing within the global refugee system. I think Antonio Guterres, when he was High Commissioner for Refugees, said that if there is one protocol that is yet to be drafted to complement the 1951 Convention, it is one on international solidarity and burden sharing. So within this context that we've been discussing about, climate migration, state fragility, the corona crisis, how can we evolve as a global society towards a more equitable form of burden sharing?
It's a really important issue, and I think to date, I think the outlook is maybe not so optimistic. I think part of the problem is that there are a number of legal norms or well-established norms around issues of the refugee regime, such as non-refoulement, which is the idea of not sending asylum seekers back to their countries of origin. But the idea of burden sharing, both, and I think you can split it up in terms of financial burden sharing and physical burden sharing, is a seriously contentious issue. So as you say, countries within the global south particularly a country like Lebanon, where about 25% of the population is a refugee or an asylum seeker, versus much wealthier countries within the EU, which are squabbling over quotas that, in certain cases are as low as in the hundreds, and even this is unacceptable to some European countries. So I think fundamentally there's a power dimension here, and I think this idea of burden sharing really reflects the kind of the divisions between global north and global south, in that fundamentally a lot of refugees are displaced either within their own countries as internally displaced populations or in neighboring countries. So given that a lot of these kind of refugee crises are in the global south, this means that the majority of the world's populations are in the global south. And I think currently the political will is just not there to establish some kind of equitable burden sharing system. I think looking at Europe, I think the case of the 2015 so-called refugee crises in Europe, where I think Germany tried, but ultimately failed to get some kind of legally based quota system in the EU to distribute this so-called burden. I think because I think the language here is also indicative that refugees are necessarily a burden. It really kind of is a testament to the difficulties in getting this done. So, I think it's, on the one hand, I think countries in the global north, countries like Norway in particular, or Sweden or Denmark, have certainly in terms of financial resources been contributing to burden sharing. But when it comes to actual physical burden sharing, a lot of them are much more reticent. So it remains to be seen, Carlota. I wish I had good news in that respect of a reopening of the 1951 convention to better delineate the responsibilities around burden sharing. But I think as it stands, that's still some ways to go to achieve that.
Well, thank you so much, Ian, for a really interesting conversation and for shedding light on some very important human rights and humanitarian topics. I really enjoyed our conversation, and thanks again for joining me.